In this video, I want to show you two proofs with errors in them and explain what the error is. It's an important type of error to avoid. So first, clearly P can be true without the conjunction of P and Q being true. That happens when P is true and Q is false. So P doesn't entail the conjunction P and Q. Now, our proof system is only supposed to allow us to derive a conclusion from some premises when that conclusion actually does follow from those premises. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to trust our proof system. Deriving a conclusion from some premises wouldn't mean that that conclusion actually follows from those premises. So we shouldn't be able to derive P and Q from P within our proof system. But now consider this reasoning from P as premise to the conclusion P and Q. First, we temporarily suppose that Q is true in addition to our premise. Then, from P and Q separately, we can derive the conjunction of P and Q. But then from a conjunction, we can derive either conjunct. So from line 3, we can derive Q. And then from P and Q separately, we can derive the conjunction P and Q. Something has to have gone wrong here, but what? The problem comes at line 4 when we say that we're allowed to derive Q from the conjunction P and Q at line 3 using the conjunction elimination rule. When we close the subproof and return to the original column of reasoning, we're back to making claims about what follows from our original premise alone. So when we write Q back in our original column of reasoning at line 4, we're saying that Q follows from our premise alone. But the conjunction P and Q from which we're attempting to derive Q isn't something that we've shown to follow from our premise alone. All we demonstrated is that P and Q follows from our premise plus an additional assumption. If we had shown that P and Q followed from our premise alone, then we'd be entitled to conclude that Q follows from our premise alone, because anytime P and Q follows from a set of statements, Q follows from that set of statements too. But because all we've shown is that the conjunction P and Q follows from our premise plus the extra assumption Q, we can't then say that Q follows from our premise alone. Now, while that explains intuitively why it would be a mistake to derive Q at line 4 from P and Q at line 3, you might wonder why it's not technically allowed by the rules. Doesn't the conjunction elimination rule just say that from a conjunction you can derive either conjunct? We've got a conjunction at line 3, Q is one of its conjuncts, so what's the problem? Even if we shouldn't be allowed to write Q down at line 4, you might wonder, don't the rules technically allow that? Well, no, they don't. And the reason is that the rules are not quite as simple as they may sound. The key point is that in order to use a rule of inference to draw some further conclusion, the things to which you are going to apply the rule, the things that are going to serve as inputs to the rule, which in this case was the conjunction P and Q, must be available to serve as inputs to the rule. And that means not only that those things must appear earlier in the proof, but that they must appear earlier in the proof without being inside of a subproof that's already been closed off. The things that appear inside of a subproof that has already been closed can't be used anymore. That's because they were derived under an assumption that's no longer being assumed to hold true. So, going back to our erroneous proof, the problem is that by the time we get to line 4, the conjunction P and Q is not available to serve as an input to the conjunction elimination rule or to any other rule. And that's because while the conjunction P and Q does occur at an earlier line, namely line 3, it only occurs inside of a subproof that's already been closed off by the time we get to line 4. So P and Q was derived under an assumption that's no longer being made. So it's no longer available for use by the time we get to line 4. If we hadn't closed the subproof with Q as its temporary subposition, if we were going to continue supposing that Q was true, in other words, in addition to our premise. And so line 4 was still going to be a part of that subproof, then the conjunction P and Q would still be available for use at line 4, and so we could derive Q from it at that line. But that wouldn't get us any closer to what the proof was originally trying to accomplish, which was deriving P and Q from P alone. Let's look at one more flawed attempt to derive P and Q from P in order to highlight one last point. So here's another erroneous derivation of P and Q from P. First, we temporarily suppose Q to be true. Then, before discharging that assumption, we make yet another temporary supposition, this time supposing that not P and Q is true. Then from P and Q separately, we derive their conjunction, and from P and Q and not P and Q, we derive absurdity. Then we close the subproof that begins with not P and Q, and again from P and Q separately, we derive their conjunction. Then we close the subproof that begins with Q, so we're back to the original column of reasoning, and we appeal to the reductio rule and the subproof that begins with not P and Q and ends with absurdity to derive not P and Q, from which we then derive P and Q. Let me comment on a few of the steps. First, line 4. At line 4, both P and Q are available. That's because both P and Q appear earlier in the proof, and they don't just occur inside of a subproof that's already been closed off by line 4. Neither was derived under an assumption that is no longer being made. So at line 4, we're free to use both P and Q as inputs to the conjunction introduction rule and derive their conjunction. Next, line 6. At line 6, we close the subproof that has the negation of P and Q at the top of it and move back one column into the subproof that has Q at the top of it. Often when we close a subproof, we draw a conclusion from that subproof right away. If we were to do that here, that would mean writing down not P and Q at line 6, appealing to the reductio rule and the subproof from lines 3 to 5 as our justification. But it's no violation of our rules to just close a subproof and then not do anything with it right away. Indeed, you can start a subproof, reason within it for a bit, close it, and not do anything with that subproof at all for the entire rest of the proof without violating any rules of our proof system. In that case, you'd certainly have unnecessary steps in your derivation, but that's different from having steps that aren't allowed by the rules. So there's nothing wrong at line 6 when we close the subproof that we were just working in, but then don't do anything with that subproof right away. Instead, we derive the conjunction P and Q from P and Q separately. Both P and Q are available at line 6, so there's nothing wrong with this step either. The problem comes at line 7, after we've also stopped temporarily supposing that Q is true, closing the subproof that begins with Q and returning to the original column of reasoning. By the time we get to line 7, it's true that there is, earlier in the proof, a finished subproof with not P and Q as its temporary supposition and absurdity as its conclusion. And the reductio rule does say that given a subproof like that, we can derive not P and Q. But what that means is that if a subproof like that is available at the current line, then we can write down not P and Q at the current line. And the subproof that starts with the temporary supposition not P and Q and concludes with absurdity is itself inside of a subproof that's already been closed by the time we get to line 7, namely the subproof that goes from line 2 to line 6. Because the subproof that begins with not P and Q and ends with absurdity is itself inside of a subproof that's already been closed by line 7, it's not available at line 7 to be used as input to the reductio rule. That subproof beginning with not P and Q and ending with absurdity was generated under an assumption, namely the assumption Q, that's no longer being assumed to hold by the time we get to line 7. Had we kept the subproof with Q at the top of it open at line 7, had we, in other words, continued to suppose that Q is true for another line, then the subproof that begins with not P and Q and ends with absurdity would have been available for use at line 7. So in that case, we could have legitimately written down not P and Q at line 7 by applying the reductio rule to the subproof from lines 3 to 5. And then, still working under the assumption that Q is true, we could have derived P and Q from not P and Q. But that wouldn't have gotten us any closer to our ultimate goal, which was deriving P and Q from P alone, not deriving it from P plus the extra assumption Q. The overall lesson is that the inputs to a rule of inference, whether those inputs are formulas or whole subproofs, have to be available, meaning not tucked away inside of a subproof that's already been closed, in order to legitimately apply a rule of inference to them. And that's because once a subproof has been closed, then the things inside of it were all derived under an assumption that's no longer being made.